but they are Galatians, Ephesians, and Colossians, or letters to the churches in Galatia, which is a region in modern-day Turkey. It's called Galatia because the Gauls, who are a Germanic people, migrated there. I find that fascinating. I don't know if you do, but I was like, whoa, Celts live there. That's cool. But then, the church at Ephesus was also, it received a letter. And then the church at Colossae is interesting because, like Romans, it's the other letter that we have written by Paul that was not written to a church that he had been to before. And so what happens is there's a man named Epaphras. Epaphras goes and he listens under Paul. His life is changed. He's saved. And I love the fact that his instinct is, I need to go back to my hometown and I need to plant a church. I need to tell everyone I can about Jesus. So good on Epaphras. That's awesome. And then he writes to Paul talking about some of the problems that he's having. And so Paul writes a letter and sends it back. And so all three of these letters are dealing with a heresy that is put forward by a group of people called the Judaizers. And what they were is they were Jewish Christians who believed that you had to follow the law of Moses in order to be saved. Or in other words, like the list of all of the different, I think it's 600 something different commandments that we find in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that we need to follow all of the dietary restrictions and those things in order to be saved. And I think sometimes our instinct is to really look down on the Judaizers. And to be clear, what they're saying is wrong. Like, we are not under the old covenant. That's not the way this works. But I do think it's important for us to put ourselves into the mindset that they would have been in. Like imagine for a moment being a first century Jew. You see Jesus, okay, this is the Messiah. I want to follow what he has to do. But part of that is that covenant that you've been under, the law that you've been following your whole life, and your parents have been following, and your grandparents, and your great-grandparents, and your great-great-grandparents, all the way back to Moses, that's done now. That's fulfilled. Like that would be an incredibly difficult shift to make in our minds. And I think that rather than looking down on them or kind of mocking them for what they were thinking there, I think it's important for us to think to ourselves, where am I holding on to things that deep down I kind of know aren't true, but just because, it's what I've always believed or it's what's comfortable? Where am I adding things onto the gospel that weren't there? And I think in that sense, a lot of us are making the same mistake that the Judaizers are making, and it's important to be able to reason through that. If I had to sum up the main point of these books in one sentence, I couldn't do it. I did 2 sentences, so sorry, everybody. I cheated on this one, but it would be simply this sentence. Christ, who is above all else, fulfilled the law for us, so we must live in unity under him. And so part of that is in the book of Ephesians, after Paul reiterates and he reminds the church, we are saved by faith. We're saved by what Christ has done, not what we have done. He actually talks to them about how important it is to live in unity. Like, I love this passage in Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul says, I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. And I think it's important for us to remember, if I know that I'm a sinner who is saved by God's grace, and I know that you're a sinner who is saved by God's grace, it becomes very difficult to be petty and to kind of rip apart the church or to cause conflict. If we all realize that we are works in progress, that none of us are better than the other person, but that we're all saved because of what Christ has done, all of a sudden that's going to change our perspective of how we treat others. The next book I want to highlight is the book of Philippians, or Paul writes this to the church at Philippi. This letter is a little bit unique because Paul's not really rebuking anything. What happens here is Paul's in prison, and if you read through Acts, you know that Paul is in prison like half of his life. He spends a lot of his time in prison. The church at Philippi is concerned about this, and so they write Paul a letter, hoping to encourage him, checking on how he is, and then Paul writes back, and his message I think is incredible because it's essentially, hey, don't worry about me. I'm doing great. I'm preaching the gospel to my prison guards and they're doing awesome. I'm still writing letters. Like Paul has this incredible attitude about the suffering that he's walking through. And then he utters this phrase, which I think is incredible, or inspiring is probably the better way to put it. To live is Christ and to die is gain. Or to say it another way, Paul is like, hey, they can't win. Because if I stay alive, if they keep me alive, I can keep preaching the gospel, I can keep writing letters, I can keep pushing forward the mission of Christ, and if they kill me, then I go spend eternity with Christ right now. It's a win-win for me. And I think what an incredible perspective for Paul to have in the midst of the incredible suffering that he was walking through. And what a perspective for us to try and have as we walk through trials and tribulations, as we walk through really difficult seasons of life, to realize that no matter what happens, if we are in Christ, we win. If I had to sum up the main idea of Philippians, it would be simply this: follow the example of Christ and live with an eternal perspective. Or in other words, don't just live with this life in mind, and this life is important, but also live with the life to come in mind as well. The last section in this, or the last two books in this section of letters written to churches, is 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. These were written to the church at Thessalonica, which is super fun to say. And these are probably the earliest written documents that we have in the New Testament. They're dated to about 15 to 20 years after Jesus' resurrection, which is incredibly early. So I love that we have these. The first letter is written as an encouragement to the church to live in light of the fact that Christ could return at any moment. So as Christians, our great hope, right, is when Jesus comes back. Spoilers for the end of the Bible, Jesus comes back, he wins. It's awesome. So read Revelation. It's a good time. But we're waiting for that moment, right? And we don't know when it's going to be. Regardless of what YouTube videos tell you, we don't know when that's going to happen. And but we are told that it will be like a thief in the night, or in other words, that we're not going to know. But because of that, we need to live knowing that it could be at any time. Like, are we putting things off? Are we saying, I'll get to like what God has called me to do eventually, because we don't actually live with that perspective? And so that's what Paul is writing to encourage the church to do. 2nd Thessalonians is interesting because it's written a couple of months later, and it's kind of correcting some of the misconceptions that the church had about what Paul wrote. But it's also addressing, it seems that there's a man who came in after Paul, and he wrote a letter forging it, saying that it was from Paul. And he said, hey, Christ has already returned. You missed it, bummer. We're in the tribulation now, here it is. And I say that flippantly, but what I think is really sad about that is the church of Thessalonica was undergoing such intense persecution that they were like, yeah, that makes sense to us. And I think it's really convicting for us sometimes, like in the modern American church. Like, how often do we think of ourselves like, yeah, like, oh man, we're going through like major persecution right now. And sometimes it's a little bit humbling to compare the really small things that we go through the life-risking dangers that the early church, or even other churches in the world right now in different areas, have to go through. If I had to sum up the theme of the letters to the Thessalonians, it would be Christ could return at any moment, and so we must live in light of that.